I knew. Deep down, I always knew something was wrong, but I ignored it. She arrived late, always with an excuse ready. Work is busy, endless meetings, I need to leave early tomorrow. Words that sounded like silent knives, cutting through a space that should have been ours. Our nights, which were once filled with laughter, turned into uncomfortable silence, an abyss growing between us. And I, blinded by the desire to believe, simply accepted. Whoever loves wants to believe. But that night, something changed. It was no longer just distrust. It was real, palpable. I discovered. She was supposed to be at work, but she was at a party. Not just any party, one where her laughter echoed with others, in a place where I wasn't, where she shouldn't be. When I saw her leaving the party, wearing that dress I had never seen before, something inside me broke. That smile of hers, always so captivating, so sure of herself, seemed like a mockery of my confidence. I waited at home. I asked for explanations, of course I asked. She walked in, surprised to see me. I tried to be calm, but my voice was shaking. I asked where she was. And there, in that moment, I saw panic in his eyes. She knew that I knew. Tried to lie. A meeting that ended late, she said, without looking me in the eye, rummaging through her bag as if searching for something, anything to distract from her lie. My blood boiled. Cut that, you weren't at work, I said, voice firmer than I expected. And silence took over. She finally looked at me, surprised by the harshness in my voice, perhaps even by the certainty. No way out. How do you know, was all she managed to say, and the only response I had was silence. A heavy silence, full of pain, full of disappointment. It was enough. I didn't need any more proof or words. This was the end, and she knew it. I didn't need to scream, I didn't need to argue. I got divorced immediately. I picked up my things, left the house, and left her alone with the choices she made. But deep down, as I walked through the door for the last time, I knew it wasn't the end for her. The cold of loneliness awaited her. The void she created by betraying our trust would consume her, and that, as painful as it was not something I could save. She would have to deal with this alone. What I didn't expect, what I couldn't predict, was that the emptiness would hit her in a way she never imagined. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a real and powerful lesson. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships, and leaves deep scars. Our goal is to show the devastating consequences of these choices. Get ready for a story shocking, full of twists and intense emotions. Enjoy and stay tuned until the end. Good story. Richard watched through the living room window, the late afternoon light softly illuminating the neighborhood. He used to enjoy these moments of calm, the distant sound of cars passing by, the wind rustling the trees. But today, something bothered him deeply. He tried to focus on the numbers and graphs in front of him, but his mind kept wandering. Work, which had always been his comfort zone, seemed distant, unimportant. The silence in the house, which had previously been synonymous with peace, now made him uneasy. Next to the window, a photograph from years ago stared back at him. It was him and his wife, Laura, on a trip to the mountains. Her smile, radiant, her eyes shining with happiness. At that time, everything seemed perfect, and he believed that the love between them was indestructible. They had been together for almost 10 years, and although time had brought its difficulties, Richard always believed that the two would be able to overcome any obstacle. Laura was a charismatic woman, always surrounded by friends and coworkers. She was smart, ambitious, and dedicated to her career in marketing. His natural charm won over everyone around him. Richard remembered how she used to talk excitedly about her meetings, projects, and new contacts. Her social life always seemed busier, while he, with his more conservative job in finance, preferred the quiet routine at home, focused on the little things that gave him security. The differences between them, which previously seemed insignificant, began to stand out as the years passed. Laura loved going out, participating in events, company parties, get-togethers. For her, these moments were an extension of work, opportunities for growth and networking. Richard, however, felt uncomfortable in this type of environment. He preferred the calm nights, the intimacy of home, the comfort of knowing that, at the end of the day, the two of them would be together. In the early years, he made efforts to keep up with her. I attended parties and corporate events, always trying to show interest. But, little by little, the distance between their worlds began to grow. What was once a small inconvenience has become a kind of invisible barrier. He saw in Laura a thirst for something he couldn't fully understand, a desire to be in places and with people that seemed more exciting than the life they had together. Still, Richard believed this was part of marriage, part of the normal changes that every couple faces over time. They had a beautiful house, financial stability and, despite their divergent routines, he still saw Laura as his partner for life. The nights they spent together, when she finally got home after a long day, were moments of reconnection. Even though the conversations were brief, there was an implicit understanding that, in the end, they still loved each other. But there was something about the last few months that Richard couldn't ignore. He tried to push away his worries, to convince himself that it was just the wear and tear of everyday life, but a growing feeling that something was wrong consumed him. Laura seemed more and more distant, and he noticed the details. The most frequent excuses, the evasive looks, the cell phone always facing down on the table. Little things that, when added together, left Richard on alert. Laura, on the other hand, felt pressured. The marriage, which had previously been her base of security, now seemed suffocating at times. It wasn't that she didn't love Richard, she knew he was a good man, dedicated and faithful. But something inside her yearned for a freedom she didn't know how to express. Work, with its constant demands, offered him an escape. It was the only space where she felt control, where her ambition and charisma were immediately rewarded. Recently, Laura had accepted more social commitments linked to work, often staying out late. She told herself that these were just professional opportunities, that she needed to be present to ensure her growth in the company. Yet, more and more, I felt a disconnect with Richard. That love that previously seemed enough now seemed smaller in the face of the expectations and desires that grew within her. She was beginning to wonder if she was really happy, or if she had adapted to the idea that life should be like this, stable, predictable. Laura loved Richard's caring manner, the fact that he was a trustworthy and protective man. But at the same time, something inside her screamed for more. She couldn't define what that more was, but she knew it was absent in her life. And that made her restless, impatient. Despite these doubts that haunted her, Laura tried to maintain the appearance of normality. The smile he showed in the photos was still there, but now it seemed more like a shield, a facade to hide the whirlwind of emotions that ran inside. She told herself everything would be okay, that it was just phases. Maybe it was just the pressure of work, maybe it was the exhausting routine. But deep down, Laura knew there was something more. As Richard watched the afternoon light fade, he tried to ignore the shadows forming in his mind. Their relationship had always been built on trust, and he wanted to believe that everything was still okay. However, the silence between them grew every day, becoming unbearable. He could no longer remember the last time they had laughed together, or even looked into each other's eyes with the same tenderness as before. That night would be another one in which Laura would arrive late, and he already knew he would hear the same justification as always. He would say he was tired, she would comment on work and, in a few minutes, they would both be apart again, even under the same roof. This was the new routine. But something was about to change, and Richard could feel it, even without knowing exactly what it was. What Richard didn't know was that Laura also felt the weight of the distance between them, but she dealt with it in a different way. She looked for distractions, ways to fill the emptiness she felt. And these distractions began to take Laura to places she never imagined going. Places from which, perhaps, there would be no return. The clock on the wall made time seem slower, each second a painful beat that echoed in Richard's mind. He wondered if Laura still loved him the same way she did before, or if that smile she used to give him was just a distant memory. And what would he do if the answer he feared was right before his eyes? The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Richard. Each night seemed to drag on a path of uncertainty, doubt, and a growing tension that he could no longer ignore. Laura continued her hectic routine, going out to events and meetings, always arriving late. But now, the reasons no longer seemed convincing. There was something about her apology, a different tone, a lack of care in trying to sound convincing, as if she had given up on hiding something he hadn't yet fully discovered. Richard tried to maintain his balance. He pushed away negative thoughts, convincing himself that it was just tiredness, that the marriage was going through a difficult phase. But the silence between them was deafening. Laura seemed more distant than ever, and the space between them grew wider every night. One night, after another silent dinner, Richard decided he needed to talk to her. He could no longer live with that doubt gnawing at his mind. He waited for Laura to arrive from another event, the sound of the door opening already so familiar in the middle of the night. She entered the room, took off her shoes, and went straight to the bedroom without even looking at him. Richard felt a wave of frustration invade his body, something he could no longer hold back. "Laura, can we talk?" Her voice was firm, but with a touch of vulnerability. She stood for a moment, her back to him, before slowly turning around. Her tired eyes didn't express surprise, but something more, a resignation that made him even more suspicious. "Now, Richard," she sighed tiredly, as if the conversation was just another burden on her already long to-do list. He nodded, and she sat down on the couch, crossing her arms in a defensive stance. There was a tension in the air, as if they both knew this moment had been building up for a long time. "I need to know what's going on," he said, trying to control his breathing. "You're distant, it's not us anymore. I know the work is important, but this, between us, seems to be falling apart." Laura looked at the floor, avoiding his gaze, as if the words were weighing on her. The silence that followed was enough to make Richard's heart beat faster, an omen that something was terribly wrong. "Richard, things have changed," she finally said, her voice low, almost like a whisper. "I've changed." He leaned forward, trying to understand what that meant. The feeling that he was about to hear something devastating came over him, and his mind was already starting to put together the pieces of a painful puzzle. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, trying to remain calm. But the lump in his throat tightened more and more. Laura took a deep breath before responding. "I don't know how we got here. But I'm not the same person I was when we got married. There's a part of me that I feel like I've lost, and I'm trying to find it." Her words were vague, but the weight behind them was clear. Richard felt the ground open beneath his feet, as if he were falling into an abyss. He knew. Even before she said her next words, he already knew what was coming. "Laura, are you cheating on me?" The question came out before he could control himself, and the silence that followed was more painful than any immediate answer. She didn't need to confirm it with words. The look in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped, as if the weight of guilt had finally been laid bare, was the confession he'd been dreading. "Richard, it wasn't something I planned. I never wanted to hurt you, but you did," he interrupted, his voice cold. Her words no longer mattered. The betrayal was there, naked before him, and nothing she said would change what he had just discovered. Anger rose within him, but at the same time, there was an overwhelming emptiness. He stood up abruptly, unable to continue listening. Laura tried to get up too, extending her hand as if to ask for forgiveness, but he took a step back, refusing contact. "Don't try to explain it. Nothing you say will justify it," he said, the pain clearly written on his face. "I trusted you, and you broke that." She remained silent, tears beginning to form in her eyes, but she didn't come any closer. Richard knew that moment marked the breaking point. There was something irreversible about betrayal, something that could not be erased or forgotten. Without another word, he turned and left the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the empty house. Laura stayed where she was, staring at the place he had been seconds before, the weight of her actions finally falling on her. She knew she had destroyed something precious, and that she might never be able to fix it. That night, as Richard drove through the city, lost in thought, he tried to understand what had happened. The woman he loved, with whom he had shared years of life, had crossed a line he never imagined possible. The pain of betrayal burned in his chest, but what he still didn't know was that there was more than that betrayal. There was something even bigger, a secret that would change everything, waiting to be revealed. But he would only discover that later. For now, all he could feel was the crushing weight of disappointment. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Laura was sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. His red and swollen eyes betrayed the internal battle he was waging. Richard, standing at the door, observed every detail. It was difficult to process everything that had happened so far. The betrayal had been revealed, but what he didn't yet know, what he was about to discover, was something that would forever change the way he saw the past, the present and even the future. In the days following the revelation of the betrayal, Richard was plunged into a fog of pain and confusion. What he knew was devastating, but something about Laura, about the way she had acted since that night, made him even more uneasy. It wasn't just the betrayal itself, it was the way she dealt with it. There was a greater weight on her, something she hadn't yet confessed. The relationship between the two was falling apart. There were no more words, just the echo of what was once a happy marriage. Richard had moved into the guest room, unable to be near Laura without being overcome with anger and hurt. And she, although she tried to explain her actions, seemed even more distant. But it was her look, that empty look, that disturbed him. She seemed to be suffering in a way he didn't fully understand. One night, as he sat at the kitchen table, his hands holding a cup of coffee that was getting colder by the minute, he heard soft footsteps. Laura was in the hallway, watching him from a distance. The hesitation in his eyes was evident, but there was something more, something that looked like a mixture of fear and regret. "Richard, can we talk?" Her voice was a whisper, as if she was dreading the answer. He looked at her, his tired eyes reflecting the pain he had been carrying for days. He nodded slowly, speechless. She walked over and sat in front of him. The weight of the moment was palpable. Laura knew she could no longer hide what was coming, and Richard, although exhausted, felt that there was something bigger behind it all. "I know what I did was unforgivable," she began, her voice wavering. "I betrayed you, and this pain you're feeling, I understand will never completely go away. But there's something more, something I need to tell you, and I don't know how you'll react." Richard didn't respond immediately. He just watched her warily, his heart racing. What else could she reveal? What else could be hidden? Laura lowered her head, her hands clasped tightly, as if she was trying to gain courage. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes for a moment, and finally released the words she had been carrying for so long. "I'm pregnant, Richard." The words hit Richard like a blow. The air seemed to disappear from the room, and he needed a moment to process what she had just said. Pregnant. Laura was pregnant. He looked at her, searching for some explanation in her eyes, but all he saw was regret and fear. "Pregnant?" he finally muttered in disbelief. And it's... "I don't know," Laura interrupted, her voice cracking. "I don't know if it's yours or his." The confession fell like a bomb. Richard was silent, his face pale. Shock went through every part of his body, making it difficult to even think. The silence that followed was heavy, full of unspoken meanings. She didn't know. He could be the father, or the lover could be. The sense of betrayal that Richard felt before now seemed small in the face of this new revelation. It wasn't just a physical betrayal, it was a betrayal that had the potential to completely change their lives. If the child wasn't his, if Laura was expecting another man's child, how could he continue? How could he even look at her, or the child, without remembering the pain she had caused? When did you find out? He asked, his voice hoarse, barely audible. A few weeks ago, she replied, avoiding his gaze. I wanted to tell you before, but I didn't know how. And after everything happened, after you found out about the betrayal, I just couldn't. I didn't know what to do. So you waited? Richard stood up, pacing around the kitchen as if trying to escape reality. You were pregnant this whole time, and you didn't tell me? Didn't you think I had a right to know, Laura? She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. I was scared, Richard. Scared of losing you, scared of losing everything. I know I was wrong, I know there's no excuse for what I did, but... But what? He screamed, the pain and anger finally exploding. You didn't know whether the child was mine or another man's, and you decided to hide it from me? How could you think that would be better? She sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I'm sorry, Richard. I'm sorry about everything. I screwed up, I know that. But I didn't know what to do. I'm lost. Richard stopped, taking a deep breath, trying to control the emotions that consumed him. Her words echoed in his mind, round and round, until he no longer knew what to feel. All he wanted was an answer, an explanation that would make it all make sense, but the reality was that there was no sense. She had cheated on him, she had gotten pregnant, and now he was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. I'm going to get out of here, he said finally, his voice low, cold. I can't deal with this right now. Laura raised her head, despair written all over her face. Please, Richard, don't go, not like this. I need you. You needed me before, he replied, without even looking at her. Now, I don't know what you need. But it's not me. He left the kitchen, leaving Laura alone, broken, with her shaking hands still covering her face. The front door slammed shut, and the sound echoed through the empty house, leaving a devastating silence in the air. Richard drove for hours, aimlessly, trying to find some kind of clarity. He knew he needed time, he needed to think about what to do next. But deep down, a part of him already knew that this revelation had destroyed any chance of reconciliation. Even if the child was his, even if there was a small possibility of continuing, the betrayal had dug a hole so deep that he didn't know if he would be able to climb out of it. He stopped the car in a deserted area and stood there, looking into the emptiness of the night, trying to absorb everything that had happened. What would he do? How could he move forward knowing that the woman he loved was pregnant, and he might not be the father? How could he forgive her for this, for destroying everything they had built together? But there was a decision to be made, a truth that needed to be discovered. And even with the weight of that truth on his shoulders, Richard knew he needed to face it. Richard spent the night in the car, parked on a quiet street. Streetlights cast soft shadows on the steering wheel as he tried to collect his thoughts. The silence around him contrasted with the chaos within. Everything seemed to be falling apart. The revelation that Laura was pregnant, without knowing whose child it was a blow he never expected to face. He felt as if reality was distorting, making every minute more difficult to bear. Conflicting feelings consumed him. Part of Richard felt a visceral hatred for Laura's betrayal, for her having crossed a line that, for him, was insurmountable. The other part, however, fought against this, seeking rationality amid the emotional turmoil. He had known her for so long, their lives were so intertwined, that simply cutting all ties seemed impossible. Even now, in the midst of the heartbreak and anger, there was love. Not the same love that existed years ago, but something still present, hidden beneath layers of pain and confusion. He wondered if it was possible to move on. If there was any way to rebuild what had been destroyed. But every time he closed his eyes, the image of Laura confessing her doubts about paternity came back to him, eroding any hope of a future together. He imagined the child. What would it be like to look at her, not knowing for sure if she was your son? What would it be like to try to love this child, knowing that she could be the result of betrayal? The dilemma seemed unbearable. The sky was beginning to lighten when Richard finally decided to return home. He didn't know what he would say to Laura, or how he would react when he saw her again. But he knew he needed to face her, needed to figure out the next step, even if the path ahead was uncertain. Upon entering the house, he found her silent, sitting on the sofa, with her eyes swollen from crying. She looked like a shadow of the woman he knew, fragile, broken. When she saw him, she stood up slowly, as if she wasn't sure how to approach him. "Richard," she began, her voice shaking, but he raised his hand, asking her not to say anything. He didn't want to hear any more excuses, justifications. The words, at that moment, seemed empty. "I don't know what to do," he said, breaking the silence, his voice low and hoarse with exhaustion. "I don't know how to deal with this." Laura remained silent, biting her lip, as if the words she wanted to say were stuck in her throat. She knew there was no way to fix this, that somehow whatever choice Richard made would be painful. But there was something that still needed to be decided, and they both knew it. That child's future. "I'm going to do the paternity test," Richard said firmly, his eyes fixed on her. "I need to know if the child is mine." She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. There was no longer any way to avoid that truth. The fate of them all hung on a single answer, an answer that could define the future of not only her marriage, but also the baby growing inside her. "If it's my son, I'll be here for him," Richard continued, trying to keep his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean things between us will go back to the way they were." The pain in his words hit Laura like a knife. She knew she'd screwed up, knew she couldn't expect redemption after what she'd done, but hearing Richard's coldness, the clear separation he was imposing between her and possible fatherhood, was devastating. "What if it isn't?" she asked, in a thin voice, fearing the answer. Richard hesitated, staring at her for a long moment before responding. "If it's not my son, I don't know what to do, Laura. I don't know if I can stay here." It was the first time he had admitted to himself that perhaps there was no going back. The marriage they had built over the years was already in pieces, and this doubt, the uncertainty about paternity, was the last piece that could completely destroy any shred of trust that remained. In the following days, silence took over the house. The paternity test would be done soon, but the wait was excruciating. Richard tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept returning to the same question: how would he react, how could he handle the situation, regardless of the outcome? And more than that, he wondered if he could ever forgive Laura, not just for the betrayal, but for bringing this devastating uncertainty into their lives. Laura, for her part, was stuck in a guilt spiral. Every move he made felt wrong, every attempt at reconciliation forced. She knew that the betrayal had destroyed Richard in a way that might never be repaired. The love he felt for her, once so evident in every gesture, was now buried beneath layers of pain. She didn't know if he would be able to forgive her, and deep down she feared that maybe she shouldn't even be forgiven. Conversations between them were rare and short. Everything revolved around the child. Richard avoided talking about the future of their relationship, keeping the discussion focused on what he would do if the child were his. But for Laura, the real weight of the situation was knowing that even if the child was his, she might have already lost Richard forever. The day of the test results arrived. Laura stayed at home, waiting for Richard, her stomach churning with anxiety. She knew that this moment could seal her fate, that the truth was about to be revealed, and that nothing would be the same as before. When Richard walked through the door, his face was pale, tense. He held the envelope in his hands, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Laura watched him, unable to speak, unable to move. Richard opened the envelope slowly, as if every second was an eternity. His eyes ran over the printed words, and the world seemed to stop around him. He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath before looking at Laura. The silence was absolute. Laura held her breath, feeling the weight of that moment. He felt like his life was about to change forever, that any word Richard said next could define the rest of his existence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "It's mine." The relief that washed over Laura was instantaneous, but it only lasted a second. Richard's look wasn't one of happiness or relief. It was a tired look, from a man who had been broken in so many ways that, even with that news, the future seemed bleak. "But I don't know what that means for us," he continued, still staring at the floor. "I need time, Laura. I need time to understand how I'm going to be able to live with all of this." And, at that moment, Laura realized that, even if the son was Richard's, she might have already lost him for good. The dilemma they now faced wasn't just about parenthood. It was about how to rebuild a life that had been destroyed by their choices, and whether there was even any hope of finding a way back. Time passed, but the tension between Richard and Laura continued. The news that the child was his brought a kind of momentary relief, but it wasn't enough to repair what had been broken. The love that once brought them together now seemed like a distant memory, shrouded in pain and distrust. The months dragged by, and although they still lived under the same roof, the emotional distance between them was greater than ever. Laura tried, in every way, to regain what she had lost. The pregnancy was progressing, and she dedicated herself to preparing the house for the baby's arrival, as if creating a safe environment could bring Richard back to her. She saw him trying hard to participate, to be a present father, but even with the care and preparations, the invisible barrier between them remained insurmountable. They were no longer the same. Richard, for his part, was torn. The love for his unborn child was real, but the weight of betrayal still consumed him. Every time I looked at Laura, it was as if I was reliving that moment of revelation, the doubt, the confession. He knew that the child was not to blame, that he would be the father, but the bond with Laura was irreparably damaged. He didn't know if he could continue living that lie that, someday, they would go back to what they were. The baby's birth took place on a cold morning, under the pale light of a winter sun. Richard was there, by Laura's side, holding her hand as she struggled with the pain of labor. When the baby's cries echoed through the room, for a brief moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The weight of betrayal gave way to a pure and instinctive emotion, unconditional love for that little life that was now in his arms. They took the baby home, and for a few days, the silence that had once felt suffocating was filled with a new kind of energy. Richard dedicated himself to caring for the child with an intensity that he himself didn't know he possessed. Changing diapers, calming the cries in the middle of the night, observing the first smiles. All of this brought renewed meaning to his life. But the relationship with Laura remained broken. Despite the baby, the nights were still cold, the conversations short and emotionless. They were like strangers sharing the same house, united only by the responsibility of raising the child. There were no more kisses, caresses, nor the promise of a future together. Richard knew, deeply, that something had to change. One night, as he put the baby to sleep, Richard looked at that little face and, for the first time, realized the magnitude of his situation. He loved his son more than anything, but he also knew he couldn't continue living a life based on resentment and pain. The baby's presence was a constant reminder of what Laura had done, and he could no longer ignore the need to free himself. When he returned to the living room, he found Laura sitting, staring into space. She looked lost, as emotionally exhausted as he was. Richard sat beside her, silent, and the weight of the moment settled between them. "I tried, Laura," he began, his voice calm but firm. "I tried to rebuild what we had. For our son, for everything we've ever been. But I can't. I can't live like this anymore." Laura didn't respond right away. She knew, deep down, that this moment would come. He knew that, no matter how hard he tried, there was no way to erase what he had done, and that the distance between them would only increase. The tears that ran down his face were not of surprise, but of resignation. "I know," she finally said, her voice breaking. I know I lost you, even though I never stopped loving you. Richard looked at her sadly. He believed in her, but he also knew that love alone wasn't enough to heal the wounds she had caused. He stood up, walked to the window and looked out, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. I'm leaving, he said, the words coming out as a relief but also as a final sentence. I will be there for our son, always. But I can't stay here any longer, Laura. We both need to move on. Laura, now silently sobbing, just nodded. She knew he was right. There was no turning back. Betrayal had destroyed what they had, and, as much as he wanted a fresh start, he knew it wouldn't be possible. The days that followed were painful but necessary. Richard found a new place to live, and visits to his son became a routine. He did everything he could to be a present father, and although his relationship with Laura was cold, they maintained civility in the child's name. There was a silent acceptance that this was the end of a story that had begun with so much love, but had fallen apart along the way. For Laura, life has become a daily exercise in regret. She continued to care for her son, trying to find some peace in the fact that, despite everything, she and Richard had created something beautiful. But the loneliness she felt, the emptiness left by his absence, was something she would have to live with for the rest of her life. Richard, on the other hand, found a new way of living. He dedicated himself to his son, found solace in new friends and, little by little, began to rebuild his life. The pain of betrayal was still there, latent, but he knew that time would help him deal with it in a healthier way. He had lost Laura, but he hadn't lost himself. The betrayal ultimately destroyed their marriage, but it also forced them to face the truth about who they were and the choices they had made. Now, each one would follow their path, marked by the scars of the past, but with the hope of a future where pain would be transformed into learning. And so, Richard and Laura's story came to an end, not with a traditional happy ending, but with a realistic ending, where they both needed to face the consequences of their actions and learn to live with their choices. Now, we want to know, what did you think of this story? Leave your comment and share your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more intense stories like this. Always remembering, we do not support any type of betrayal. The stories told here are fictional, and our goal is to show how betrayal can destroy lives and relationships. Until next time.